Studios. Joining us now also in the studios, Congressman Michael Guest. He represents Mississippi's 3rd District. Thanks for coming in, Congressman.
Thanks for having me back, Gerard.
All right, so let's talk about this border situation. You know, this is one of the things that hasn't gotten a great deal of attention lately, and I think that's because Americans have been consumed with economic matters, inflation, the price of gas, and what just seems like a situation that continues to worsen. And then we've got the situation over in the Baltic with Russia and the Ukraine. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I think the administration is actually, I don't want to say happy, but maybe they're at least heartened by their getting a little bit of a respite because this is not dominating the news cycle the way it was. But we still got a big old problem down there.
You know, you're exactly right. And we saw a lot of national media coverage, particularly late spring, early summer, about just the large explosion of the number of illegal immigrants that were coming across the border. And it really started once Joe Biden was elected. Even before he started taking office, you started to see those numbers gradually increase. And then as soon as he was sworn into office, you saw those numbers just explode. And people were actually coming across the border in their Biden-Harris T-shirts. They were coming because they believed that once he was elected president that he was going to do what many of the many progressives were asking for, which was just open the border and allow anyone to come across. And so we saw those numbers continue to increase. And what you traditionally have seen is you've seen, particularly during the summer months as things would warm up and the temperatures along the border would be extremely hot, you would see the number of immigrants decrease. But we actually saw those numbers go up through the summer. We saw them hit more than 200,000 several months in a row. And those numbers have just gradually started to go down. But you're right, as far as media attention, the media has now pivoted to things such as inflation, the supply chain crisis that we're seeing, international crisis after Afghanistan. And we saw the debacle that the administration created in our withdrawal from Afghanistan. And now we're seeing that the media is focused on the international crisis that is looming between Russia and the Ukraine. And so this is an issue that's not gone away. This is something that the media has just now refused to cover because there are so many other crises which are burning more hotter than the border is at this point. But it's something that as a member of Homeland Security, we are continuing to watch, continue to monitor, and continuing to try to hold the administration accountable for their inaction along the border and their inability to stop the flow of immigrants coming into the country.
It just seems almost unthinkable to me, honestly, that we have laws on the books. We're not enforcing these laws. And, in fact, we have an administration that's basically instructing those responsible for enforcing those laws and patrolling the border to stand down, or certainly not giving them the resources necessary to discharge that function. How in the world can that happen in this country? I don't get it.
You know, until the courts get involved, until the courts mandate that the administration enforce the laws that Congress has passed, we're going to see, particularly this administration, is going to ignore the dictates of Congress. Congress has been granted the authority by the Constitution to create laws, and the president then is supposed to enforce the laws that Congress creates. If the president doesn't like the laws, he should return to Congress and ask the laws to be changed, not mandate, in some cases by executive order, that laws not be enforced. You know, if you think day one on the border, when the president was sworn into office, he set forth an executive order stopping construction on the border, wall construction, construction that Congress had approved, that money had actually been appropriated for. And what we ended up doing, Gerard, is we ended up paying those contractors not to build the wall. They had a contract with the government. They had already had supplies delivered that were sitting there on the border. We had people who were supposed to be building those structures that would have made our border safe, but the president, through the swipe of a pen, an administrative executive order, stopped construction, and it cost the American taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars for walls that we had paid for and approved but weren't built.
I'm looking at some statistics that your office supplied us with, and so Border Patrol agents have encountered almost as many criminals on the border in the first 3 months of fiscal year 22, which kicked off October 1, than all of fiscal year 20 for 12 months combined.
You're exactly right. Again, the numbers and the surge that we have seen that has taken place since President Biden was sworn into office dwarfs the numbers that we saw under President Trump. President Trump did have, at some point in his administration, a surge. He acted very aggressively. He instituted the Remain in Mexico policy, which was very effective in the fact that immigrants who were coming to the country weren't allowed to stay in the country once they entered. They had to remain in Mexico until their asylum claims were heard. The Biden administration stopped that. We've seen that the federal courts have reinstituted that, but really on a very limited basis. We've not seen this administration put the resources that we need on the border patrol, custom enforcement agents, and they've actually instructed ICE not to go out and seek people who are in the country, that we have active pickup orders for those people to be arrested and returned to their home country. I think I shared an article with you last week about TSA, which we all encounter, and we know that anyone who travels, if you're going to fly and going to be able actually to even get past the security checkpoint, you've got to produce some sort of photo ID. And we all know we come to expect that. For many of our immigrants who don't have that, TSA has been accepting arrest warrants as a proper form of identification.
I read that when you said it. I just shook my head.
And so for a federal agent to know that there's an active arrest warrant for someone, and then to not arrest that individual, allow that individual to use that arrest warrant as a form of identification to pass through a security checkpoint, to me is the most ludicrous thing that I've ever heard and ever read.
It's upside down.
And we as members of Congress just found that out because of some requested information that we did of TSA months ago that they have just now responded to. And in all of those responses, as you continue to dig through that, we find something that should be very troubling to all Americans.
It's amazing to me, Congressman, that we even have men and women that are willing to put the ICE uniform and the Border Patrol uniforms on every day, because their backs are not covered by this administration.
Oh, you're exactly right. You talk about the morale of the rank and file who are down there day in and day out trying to protect the border, and then knowing that every time that anything happens, that the administration is looking to blame them. They're looking to blame the men and women who are on the border, and they're also going to continue to blame President Trump. Now, right. President Trump has not been in office for now over a year. Yep. We know that. But any time that the administration, the current administration, the Biden administration, talks about the crisis and talks about the numbers, when we can actually get them to do that in congressional hearings, they are going to continue to deflect and continue to blame President Trump, who actually I thought did a very good job of controlling the border.
Right.
And so it's this constant case of the administration not wanting to take the blame for anything. It's always somebody else's fault. It's the men and women who are working the border. It's the policies that we inherited.
Yeah.
And they don't want to accept blame for anything.
I think the difference is the prior president, President Trump, understood and respected the idea of the nation's sovereignty and the need to have a border and to essentially enforce the laws on the books that require legal immigration. We have a president now and the accompanying party that, in effect, don't want a border. They really don't.
That's right. Many of the extreme progressives, they believe in the ideas of open borders, that people should be allowed to come into the United States, should be allowed without any sort of screening, any sort of process, that anyone who wants to come, that we should allow them to come into the country, and to very quickly become citizens. I believe in legal immigration. Sure. I believe that we have programs such as the H-2A, H-2B visa programs where we allow individuals to come into the country to work in our agriculture industry and things of that nature. Those programs have been around a long time, and those programs are very successful. I was at a Farm Bureau reception actually last night and was talking to an individual. He said, look, as we are coming into the farming season, we're going to continue to need this H-2A, H-2B labor so that we can grow the food that we need to supply not only American citizens but people across the globe. And I think Republicans and Democrats, we understand that. Those are areas where we can work together. Yeah. But we must let's make sure that our borders are secure, that we are being able to vet people who are coming into the country, and that people who want to come here legally have a route to do so, but we're not putting the illegal immigrants at the front of the line over those who are trying to do the right thing.
Common sense. It just seems common sense logic to me. We've got Congressman Michael Guest in the studio. Stay with us. Congressman Michael Guest is our guest in the studio. So, Congressman, the other thing that is of concern is the transport of fentanyl across the border as well. And we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago talking about that. I was shocked. In fact, who was it? Bain, I think, wasn't it, Rhino, a member of the legislature, our friend from Alcorn County that has a bill, I think, to address this. But I was shocked to learn just how deadly this substance is and how little is required to kill a human, and most of that is flowing across the border. But we just seem to not have an interest in that, do anything about it.
Well, and again, it's just the fact that we want to turn a blind eye to everything happening on the border. It's not just the illegal immigration, the drug trafficking, the human trafficking also accompanies that. And you're exactly right. You know, the fentanyl seizures that we saw 2021 was up over 100% from the year before. I think roughly 135%. We now see that overdose deaths in general have become one of the leading causes of death for individuals, age 18 to 45. And you're right, it takes such a small amount of fentanyl to actually put a person into cardiac arrest. And it's not just the fact that people are taking fentanyl in and of itself. It's the fact that fentanyl is often mixed with other drugs. And so people are unaware of actually what they are putting and what they are consuming into their body. And so, we saw this back when I was a prosecutor. This was something during my days as district attorney in Madison and Rankin County. We began seeing slowly the rise of fentanyl. But I tell you, under this administration, and again, the porousness of the border and our inability to secure not only the people but the things that are being trafficked into our country, this is a growing problem, and it's something that the media is not going to cover. They're not going to talk about it. Again, one of the reasons they're not going to talk about it is because the administration has done such a poor job. And so then it falls on local law enforcement, people like your local sheriff's department and police departments, to try to do what they can once the drugs are actually in the country to stop those drugs from getting into the hands, particularly of our teenagers and young adults. Those are the people that we see this more and more of. And so we've got to do a better job of giving our law enforcement on the border the resources that they need to fight this. And again, this also goes hand in hand with what we see with some of the human trafficking. We've seen many of your drug cartels now, if you will, diversify into human trafficking because there's so many people who are wanting to get across the border. And they often use some of the human trafficking as a distraction for the drug trafficking. And so if they are shifting and putting large groups of people across the border in one section, as law enforcement then responds en masse to deal with that, then they're using some of the same resources that they have to ship the drugs across through other unsecured portions of the border at that point. And so whether it be fentanyl, whether it be cocaine, whether it be methamphetamine or marijuana seizures, all those seizures have continued to grow up under this administration, which means that the drug cartels see our borders as porous and see their ability to ship their product into their country, into this country, as something that they're more and more readily able to do. Yeah,
it's just amazing how, as you said, we've pivoted to other matters, and those are important matters as well. But this is going on 24 hours a day. This isn't going away, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite whatsoever to address it. We have a vice president who was appointed as the so-called border czar that I think is yet to go to the border. It just seems like, as one who's responsible for policy, and that being the president, you go down there and talk to the people responsible that are experiencing this every day and get them to share what the issues and the challenges are and get their recommendations and make policy accordingly. But that just doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I had the ability last spring to go down with several members, Republican members of the Homeland Security Committee, and we embedded ourselves there with law enforcement. And we were there, and we saw the gaps that existed in the wall, to where the wall had been built to a certain area and then just stopped. And we saw again the construction material there, where the materials had actually been delivered to extend the wall, but because of the president's signature on the executive order, wall construction had stopped. We saw immigrants who had come across the border, and they were walking up to law enforcement to turn themselves in because they knew that they were not going to be deported, because they were with young children. If you have a minor child with you, the policy of the current administration is you are allowed to remain in the country. So these people would walk across the border. They weren't running from law enforcement. They were there to turn themselves in because they knew that they would be processed. And then after that they were processed, the non-government agencies that our that our government contracts with would then fly them into the interior of the country, and they would be allowed to stay with family members or friends who were also in the country. And so there is no fear that immigrants, once they reach the border, will be turned back and that they will be denied entry. And these numbers are growing, and you were starting to see that the impact that it's having, not just on our border communities, but on really every community in our country, as more and more of the immigrants are being resettled throughout the country.
Can't escape it.
And then what normally happens is there is a 1 million case backlog in our immigration court. A million cases. And so we saw those numbers grow. And so by the time the case works its way through the system, we've lost track of where these immigrants are, and they're able to remain in the United States indefinitely.
I know you're in town. You're in the state for a while before you go back to Washington, right?
Yes, sir, for the remainder of the week. That's correct.
What do you got going on in Mississippi you want to tell us about?
We're going to meet tomorrow with some of our law enforcement officers in Rankin County. Sheriff Brian Bailey, a great friend of mine, has a monthly chiefs meeting where he brings in all the chiefs of police really throughout the entire metro area, and where they talk about the issues that they're battling and dealing with. And I think that one of the issues that we're seeing and that we're actually seeing being reported by the local and national media is the increase in violent crime. We see that crime continues to go up. A lot of that kind of was born out of this defund the police movement. And so, we saw several years ago that there was a big push by progressives and liberals to do away or to cut the size of police departments. And we've seen in those cities to where they've not adequately funded resources to law enforcement, we've seen increase in crime. And we've seen that here in the Jackson area. I don't know, you may have seen it, and I'm sure you've seen it and talked about, that per capita, Jackson had the highest murder rate of any city in the entire country. And so it's not just cities such as Chicago, Illinois, or New York, or other places. This is happening right here in our backyard. And so we look forward to working with law enforcement to trying to see what they're seeing on the ground, and how there can be, that state, federal, local response, and what we can do plugged in going forward. I had a chance to be in Starkville yesterday, got a chance to introduce two young men who had been, one had been accepted to the United States Naval Academy, one had been accepted to prep school there at West Point. Awesome. And I'll tell you, one of the greatest things about this job is being able to meet young men and women who want to serve and who want to go to our military academies, and to see the hard work that these young men and women pour in throughout their high school career to position themselves for appointments, and then be able to see that dream come true is something that is very special. And so we got a chance to do that yesterday in Starkville, a young kid from Starkville Academy, another young kid from Starkville High School, and they are the best of the best that Mississippi has to offer. That's
awesome, and we applaud them for making that decision to serve their country. We need good people doing that, as you well know. We got just a couple of minutes left. This voting rights situation has just become hyper politicized, to say the least. You got the president essentially calling half the country equating them to Jefferson Davis and Bull Connor and the like. Where do you think all this is going, this voting rights deal?
I think at this point it's dead. I think that the Democrats tried to really make, if you will, a mountain out of a molehill, tried to create an issue that really doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in states' rights, and that states should have the ability to set reasonable restrictions on voting. And what the Democrats were trying to make this into is that there were states that were trying to restrict people, to keep people from being able to vote. And that was not the case.
Right.
We must have, and I will tell you as a former prosecutor, I have seen cases of voter fraud. Now, that they don't happen every day, but there are cases of voter fraud. And the thing that I saw as a prosecutor that really addressed that more than anything was voter ID. I think that was one of the best things that Mississippi was able to implement. I've got to give Delbert Hoseman and his staff credit for working with the Justice Department to get that in place. But what the Democrats were trying to do was to remove voter ID, allow same-day voter registration, allow voting on demand, really kind of taking away some of the reasonable restrictions that states had put in place.
Man, yeah, it's just crazy. I think it's totally fabricated. I think they're just trying to deflect to the real problems. Before you go, Haley and the family good?
Everybody's great. Yes, thank you for
asking.
asking.
That. Yes, sir. Congressman Michael Guest has been our guest here in the studio at SuperTalk. We'll be right back. Middays. We'll